In the last couple of videos, we talked about normal functions and how you can actually pass functions to other functions. And in this video, we're going to talk about arrow functions, which are another way of writing out functions. They're both very similar to each other, but they have some unique differences that we're going to talk about in this video. So let's just take our very standard function here, which is called sum, and it is taking parameters a and b, and it's just going to return a plus b. And if we just call this, just to make sure it's working, we can say console.log sum of 1 and 2. So we're passing the result of sum of 1 and 2 to our console.log function. We get 3 being printed out. So now what is it going to take for us to convert this function sum into an arrow function? Well, with an arrow function, you don't actually use the function keyword. Instead, you are defining a variable. In our case, we'll create a variable called sum arrow to define that this is our arrow function here. And then we need to set this equal to something. So what we need to do is set it equal to an arrow function. And an arrow function is defined by first creating our parameters up here. Because what we've essentially done is here we have function sum, and then we do all of our function stuff afterwards. With an arrow function, we're using let to say we're creating a variable. We give it a name just like we would a function, and then we set equals, and then we start off with the next step, which is our parentheses. So we'll say parenthesis a and b, just like that. So we have our exact same parameters here for both of them. And then what gives it the name arrow function is we actually write out an arrow by putting an equal sign and a greater than sign. What this is saying is take these parameters and then run this code afterwards. So we'll use our opening and closing braces, just like we have up here. And inside of here, we return a plus b, just like we would in this function up here. So the only real difference between these functions is instead of using the function keyword, we use let to create a variable. And when you create a variable, you need the equal sign to essentially assign it to something. So we have our equal sign to say we're assigning it to this arrow function. And the only thing that's different about an arrow function is you squeeze an arrow in here between this opening curly brace and the end of your parentheses. So now let's replace sum here with sum arrow. And if we save, you notice 3 gets printed out again. And the nice thing about arrow functions and normal functions is once you've defined an arrow function and a normal function, you use them exactly the same way. For example, if we console log sum arrow, and I just get rid of this log down here, when we save, you can see we get a function over here. It takes the parameters a, b, takes the parameters a, b, and then it's going to return a plus b. Just like if we were to log out sum, they both are functions, as you can see, and they both have essentially the same definition of a plus b being returned. Let's go back to that sum arrow there, and as you can see, it's essentially just a function. So we can pass an arrow function to another function, just like we would a function. They're exactly the same thing, they're just defined slightly differently. So now it's your turn. I want you to create your very first function. That's an arrow function. So I want you to take this function called printName, which takes in a name and does console.log of name. I want you to create this as a function. So pause the video here and attempt this yourself. Okay, hopefully you gave yourself a little bit of time to do this. So all we need to do to create this is we create a variable with a let, give it the name we want. We'll call it print name arrow. And we need to set this equal to a value, which is our arrow function. Let's get our arguments, which is just the name inside parentheses here. Put in the arrow, which really makes this an arrow function. Put in our brackets, and we'll just say console.log of name. Now, if I save this, you'll notice we don't get any errors. Everything looks good. And we can come down here and just say print name arrow, pass it in our name, which is Kyle. Click save, you can see it prints out Kyle. And if we just call print name, not print name arrow, and save, you'll see it also prints out Kyle. Something interesting you'll notice though is when I saved, Prettier actually removed the parentheses around our name. There used to be parentheses here, as you remember, and when I click saved, they went away. Why exactly is that? Because if I have 2 parameters here, for example, name and age, and I click save, you'll notice that it doesn't get rid of the parentheses. When it's just name and I save, it gets rid of the parentheses. Well, the reason for that is that arrow functions, when you have just one single argument, as for example here, we have one argument name, the parentheses around it are actually optional. You can put them here and it'll work just fine with them here, but you don't need them. So you can actually leave off the parentheses if it's a single argument. So if you have just one single argument, you can leave off the parentheses and instead just put the name of the variable, and then you can put the arrow here and everything else will be exactly the same. Now, if you don't really like this and you like having the parentheses there, you can go into your settings here, type in prettier and type in arrow. And you can see here it says arrow parens include parentheses around a sole arrow function parameter. Just click always. And now when we save, you can see it'll always make sure parentheses are here. So if you prefer that setting to realize your code, make it easier to work with, you can enable that if you want, or you can just leave it as the default. It is entirely up to you and what your preferences are. So now let's go back to this sum function that we had here, where we're going to take in a plus b, whoops, not a plus b, a and b, like that, and we want to return a plus b. And let's get our arrow version, which is sum arrow. We're going to have a and b here, our arrow, and then we're just going to return a plus b. Now let's just make sure we try this out to make sure it works. Console.log sum arrow of 1 and 2. And you can see we get 3 being printed out. So this function is working as we expect. Another really unique thing about arrow functions that you can't do with normal functions is that if you just have one line in your function and that one line is returning something that you want to return, you can actually leave off this return keyword here, and you can get rid of these curly braces here and put this on one line. So you can see here we have our parentheses for our parameters, we have the arrow, and then we actually have the function body itself, a plus b. And if we save, you see it still returns 3 for us. And the reason that this is working is because when you have one line on an arrow function and you don't put any curly braces at all, and all you do is just have this single section of code, it's going to automatically return whatever you put inside of here. So it's the same thing as if we had put return here and we put it inside of curly braces like this. But since all we're doing is returning this one simple thing, we can just leave off the return, leave off the curly braces, and it's going to give us the exact same result. And again, if this is something you don't like, then you don't have to do it. You can just write it out normally, like this on multiple lines, and it's going to do the exact same thing. So you only have to use these kind of cool little syntactical, shortcuts if you like them. You don't have to use any of them if you don't want to, which is the nice thing about JavaScript. It adds new features, but you don't have to use those new features. You can continually use the old features and write it out like this if you're more familiar or more comfortable with it that way. So now I want to give you a little bit of an exercise. I want you to take the function called print hi. I'm going to take in a name, and all this function is doing is returning hi. We'll do a capital hi plus the name. What I want you to do is I want you to convert this to an arrow function, but I want you to do it all on one line. I don't want you to use the return keyword. I want you to use that nice little trick that I just taught you. So pause the video here, take a second to try this out, and then come back and I'll show you how to do it. So with that done, let's just come down here. We're going to create our variable with let, call it print hi. We'll call it arrow just so that they're different names. And we're going to give this set this to equal here. And then we're going to give it a parameter, in our case, name. And remember, since it's just one single parameter, we can get rid of the parentheses and just have the parameter name here of name. Then we're going to put our arrow. And normally we would get our parentheses here, our curly braces, and do return on another line. But like I said, we want to do this all on one line. And since we're returning just one single thing, it's implied that we're doing the return. So we don't need to put the return keyword here. Instead, we just start off with hi, and then we're going to put plus name. So now if I just call that function, print hi arrow, pass it in the name of Kyle, and save, and make sure I actually log this out. So console.log, there we go, and click save. You can see it says hi Kyle. And if I use just our normal print hi instead of the arrow version and click save, again, it'll say hi Kyle. Now this may have been a little tricky when you're going through it yourself. Probably the biggest thing that you run into is just to make sure that you don't have any of these curly braces around here. That's going to be a big problem because now if I run the print name or print hi of the arrow, it is no longer going to actually return anything for me because we don't have our return keyword. It's important to make sure you always have your return keyword if you're using this bracket version here. But if you're doing it on one line, the problem that again a lot of people run into is that they put the return keyword, and this is just straight up wrong. You can't have return on here. You need to make sure you leave that off because it's implied that you are doing the return. Now the very last thing about arrow functions that confuses some people is if we have a function with no parameters. So if we have a function that just says hi, and all it does is console.log out hi. So if we have this, how would you convert this to an arrow function? Well, to get started, we just replace the word function with let. We put our name here, which is hi. We'll make sure it's a different name of hi arrow though, an equal sign, and then we need to put our arguments. But we don't have any arguments, so we just do an empty set of parentheses, just like we do up here with our normal function. Then we put in the arrow, put in our curly braces, and then we can say console.log of hi. Hi. And now if I call hi arrow, you can see it just prints out hi as we would expect, and our normal hi function prints out hi as well. They both work exactly the same. And you'll notice that I'm giving these functions and variables different names. The reason for that is if I were to create here hi with the exact same name and save, you're going to see I'm getting an error. It says identifier hi has already been declared. And the reason for that is I already have a function with the name hi. I can't also create a variable with the name hi as well. All your variable and function names must be unique. So I can't have hi here and hi up here. That's why I was naming this hi arrow. So now you're probably asking yourself, why would I use an arrow function? Why can't I just use a normal function here? The normal function makes more sense to write. Arrow function is kind of confusing. It has a lot of weird rules. Why would I want to use an arrow function? Well, the biggest reason to use an arrow function is for passing functions to other functions, because it allows you to write much less code. Let me show you exactly what I'm talking about here. So let's just say we have a function here that just takes in, whoops, we're going to call this func. It's going to take in a variable x and a callback, and all it's going to do is just call the callback with x being passed to it. So now let's call func. And if we want to do an inline function, so let's just say 10 here, and we want to do an anonymous function here, normally we would say function, then we're going to have our parentheses. This is going to take in a variable, and then we're going to say console.log out our variable. And if we save, you're going to notice it prints out 10 because it's calling the callback, which is this function we passed in here, and it's logging out that variable. But the problem is it's kind of a little bulky. We have this big function keyword here, and that you can get rid of with an arrow function. If we get rid of the function keyword, and we just put our arrow in place here, now we've done the exact same thing, but with an arrow function instead. And when I click save, you can see it still prints out 10. So when you create an anonymous function from a normal function, all you're doing is removing the name here, but you still need the function keyword. When you're creating an anonymous arrow function, what you need to do is just have your parentheses, your arrow, and then your actual code inside of here. And what we're essentially able to get rid of is the let as well as our name here. So we're getting rid of all of this part of our code when we create an anonymous arrow function. And these arrow functions just allow you to write slightly more condensed and small code, especially if we move it onto one line. For example, here, we can get rid of all these parentheses here, and we can move this onto one line, and it's still going to do the exact same thing. So it's just a slightly more condensed way of writing out these anonymous functions, and this is what most people will use arrow functions for. And that's about all there is to arrow functions. In the next video, we're going to be talking about the stack trace as well as the call stack, which are really great tools that you can use in order to debug your code and really find all the errors that you run into. I can't wait to see you in that next video.